Hey, welcome back to Final Trade. I published a video about 2 weeks ago on the topic of why I thought that artificial intelligence and card grading would eventually make the price of card grading plummet. And I got a response from a viewer that was really interesting. I think the essence of his disagreement was that he thinks that you can never truly remove humans from the card grading process completely. And a lot of his argument revolved around the idea that there are just highly nuanced and rare edge cases for which it's too hard to program an AI or train an AI to do card grading. And it got me thinking a lot. And the more I thought about it, the more I thought there's really kind of three questions here when it comes to fully removing humans from card grading, which, spoilers up front, I think humans should have no part in card grading. I think it should be entirely an objective, automated process, and I think we can get there. So, the first question is, what what role should subjectivity play in card grading? And if you go to PSA's website, they have this little several paragraphs of text they've written about the importance of subjectivity and eye appeal in card grading. And they talk about how you can have various cards with, and just the examples they use are centering issues, but because of the color of the border and the color of the rest of the card, the centering issues may or may not look as good or as bad as they really are. And they use that example to say that, well, even if the centering is perfect, we may give a lower score because the eye appeal is not as good, or even if the centering is not great, we might give a higher score because the eye appeal is not hurt by the bad centering, depending on the colors of the border and the rest of the cardigan. And I think this is dangerous in the sense that I don't want a grader working for any grading house having an argument with his wife in the morning before he leaves for work. And then he comes in and all day long, on average, he just gives marginally lower scores to cards than he otherwise would have. And so when you have that kind of subjectivity in there, it's like a built-in defect in the process. And you can get things that should not matter, like the particular mood of the grader, influencing what kind of grades they give. So I feel like I have more of a Judge Dredd attitude on grading cards. Like the law is the law, and it should be objective, and you should follow it. So the second thing that this person's comments made me really think a lot about was how certain types of damage to cards kind of get a pass in grading. And I guess the best one is ink dots. And so for the most part, ink dots don't hurt your grade. Now, some of the grading houses have this kind of extra level where they're like gem mint or something where, it's supposed to signify that the printing of the card itself is perfect. And again, that goes back to the subjective eye appeal, but print dots kind of get caught up in that. And so while print dots are not a physical piece of damage to the card, they do detract from it. They are a malfunction of the process of either producing or keeping the card over time. And so we have all these regular things that no one disagrees should be part of grading, like damaged corners, damaged edges, a roughed up surface, cuts, bends, chips, mold, those kind of things. But we have these more contentious ones. Early on in Magic's history, there were a lot of sets that had roller marks on them from the printing presses. And so in some of those sets, it's very, very hard to find graded tens because of those roller marks. But you also have some Yu-Gi-Oh cards where the foil stamping was done under way too high a pressure. And so you'll see the imprint of the stamping on the back of the card. And, should that get a pass? Because if the pressman who set up and operated the press caused there to be print dots and ink bleeding and all these other defects, he also caused that stamping issue. He also caused the roller issues. Another one is there were a lot of foiled sports cards from the mid to late 90s, and there's some nuance of their process where, depending on how they've been stored over the last 2.5 decades, they will turn varying shades of green. And so if you do a Google search for hulked out sports cards, you'll find message boards and pictures and everything discussing them. And so should that count against the grading? And you have the terrible situation where you send one of those potentially hulkable cards off to be graded, and let's say it comes back a 10, and then over the next 10 years, as you've got it sitting wherever you sit them, it turns green. Does that still deserve a 10? We kind of take as an article of faith that once you sealed a graded card inside this slab, then it will never change again. But the reality is they can. They can still oxidize to some extent, and they can still have color changes and things like that. And so this is more of like a philosophical question. I don't have the answers here because I can't come up with a consistent set of rules to follow that I think would satisfy us in all cases here. But what kind of detrimental characteristics of a card should and shouldn't count against grading? Maybe what you need is more subgrades. Instead of the traditional corner, edge, surface, and centering, maybe you also need printing quality. Maybe you need like printing damage or something. I mean, that doesn't sound very nice, but there's got to be some other way to try and objectively quantify these things. And so that's more of a long-term soul seeking that the grading houses have to do on their own. And the nice thing is there's like, what, 5, 6, 7 big grading houses, depending on what type of cards you're into. And so you can probably find one that has a philosophy that aligns with yours pretty closely. The third question that I thought this person's comments really stimulated in me was, can AI be trained to detect those weird edge cases? And so you have these really rare hulked out sports cards from the 90s. You have these really rare Yu-Gi-Oh cards. And, you have really odd things. I showed on my channel once a card I had that had a alignment mark that was not taken off during stripping and pre-press. And, weird things like that are just very, very, very rare edge cases. Can you train the AI to detect them? Yes, eventually. The strength of an AI in image recognition is always going to be relative to the size of the library and the relevancy of the images within that library that you trained it with. And so if you come up with enough pictures, you can train it. But can you do that now? Probably not. It's going to be really hard to come up with enough pictures of cards with strip marks on them. But you may be able to some extent train that while training other things. So, when the AI is learning how to identify mold on a card or inking, for instance, it may be something that it'll be able to detect through that training. That starts to kind of bleed out into what I don't understand about AI. How good is it on peripheral things like that? So maybe I'm incorrect there. But ultimately, I do think you can immediately probably remove humans halfway from grading. You could probably do that today. And, after PSA acquired Genamint earlier this year, they did a bunch of demos showing how they would upload pictures of a card and get some what they kind of termed at the time preliminary grades, and then they would put it in front of the human. And I think over time, as you train the AIs better, as you gain more confidence, as you develop rigorous recursion testing to do after you make changes, after you tune the AI, I think you could, within 3 to 5 years, you could probably remove humans from grading 95% of the way. And so probably for a long time, there will probably be a long tail of time when you still pass every card in front of a human just to have them glance at it real quick, just to make sure there's nothing terrible going on that the machine somehow missed. Eventually, though, I think humans will be taken completely out of it, and you'll be able to pick up those weird edge cases like hulked out cards. And again, that comes back to whether or not you think that should count against the card in the grading. And pick up weird things like overstamped Yu-Gi-Oh cards and stuff like that. So let me know if you disagree with this, but mostly my answer is I think, but I'm not sure, but probably eventually. So I'm interested in the comments, and I try to reply to all of them. So let me know what you think about that. Ultimately, my thesis that the price of grading cards will plummet, I think that's still in place. I still believe that. I think in the 3 to 5 year time period, those old timey bulk prices of $6, $7, $8 a card, I think those will come back. I think eventually we'll go even below that, and that's even counting things like inflation. I think AI is just gonna, it's going to increase the margins on this so much that um, companies will be able to lower prices drastically in order to compete and expand the revenue. So, um, yeah, if you're interested in these kind of topics, these kind of talks, like, comment, share, and subscribe. Join me on Final Trade and come along. Thanks a lot.